Well then, we have covered the changes that 9.0.5 has brought to Raid. We have looked at some of the specs that have clearly improved in their performance when it comes to raids, as well as some of the specs that clearly went down. Now, spoilers, if you haven't watched that video already, Windwalker Monk and Marksmanship Hunter were the two main specs that have worsened their status, their standing in raids, due to their fixes. Marksmanship's fix to their Serpent Stalker's Trickery Legendary interaction with Wild Spirits, no longer proccing twice, lowering heavily their AoE damage, as well as Windwalker Monk's fix towards their Storm Earth and Fire images, no longer channeling Fist of Fury when you cancel yourself your Fist of Fury cast. And then we have looked at the improvements of some of the specs particularly highlighted. We had Assassination Rogue, we had Elemental Shaman, and then slightly less, but still a decent improvement, we had Retribution Paladin, and we had Havoc Demon Hunter. Retribution had a single target focused legendary being buffed, Final Verdict, and Havoc has an old forgotten legendary Burning Wound being buffed as well, being used in raid encounters. And then for Assassination and Elemental, it was more of a series of buffs. Elemental lowered the damage of Lava Burst, but increased the damage, particularly of Earthshock, by 30%, Chain Lightning by 35%, base damage of Earthquake by 70%, so a series of buffs for Elemental as well as for Assassination. On top of the 5% damage to all abilities and then 8% damage to all abilities, they have gotten some energy generation buffs, as well as one of their legendaries, Doomblade, also buffed. So after these buffs and nerfs have affected the, let's say, raiding meta for now, we have to look at Mythic Plus, the other part of the PvE content, of the PvE competitive side of the game. And we have to look if whether or not these specs are essentially changing the same way they are changing in raids. Now, let's look at the actual participation numbers though, because maybe all of this is wrong. Maybe the community doesn't care. Maybe the community hasn't even realized yet, and the numbers won't really reflect any of these changes. Now, this is how we left ourselves a couple of weeks ago when it came to healers. Now, if you have followed our changes related to healers regarding healers, you have seen that not really much has changed when it comes to healers. We only had the major change to Restoration Druid, buffs to Rejuvenation and Wild Growth, and then the nerfs to Spirit Shell for Discipline Priest. Now, Spirit Shell is not as important in Mythic Plus when it comes to the strength of that ability for preventing damage compared to, for example, raid encounters, and also Discipline Priest wasn't even that prevalent in Mythic Plus. What we can see is the same thing we have been seeing for the last few weeks, regardless of the 9.0.5 changes, which is that Holy Paladin has overtaken Restoration Druid in popularity, and that so far, at the very least, the buffs to throughput to Restoration Druid have not really made them stand up more than before. Even when you go in the higher window, even when you go in the plus 20 key range, you're still in the same situation where Restoration Druid is even lower than Discipline, regardless of the buffs. The same thing we have also pointed out before, which is that at the very highest of keys, Holy Paladin is starting to pass Restoration Shaman. This is due to a multitude of reasons. It can be because of their damage, the burst they can bring at very high keys, overtaking the ones of Restoration Shaman, which, by the way, was also nerfed this patch. Restoration Shamans have been hit by collateral damage. In the attempt of rebalancing the damage profile of Elemental, the 10% Lava Burst nerf also hit Restoration Shaman. They did get a 35% buff to Chain Lightning, but that's not nearly as powerful. Or maybe it could be because of Ventir. There are more Holy Paladins, especially the ones in pre-made, pre-organized groups, coordinated groups that want to run 20 and plus keys, where Paladins can go Ventir. This makes it also better for your composition when it comes to Covenant buffs. There aren't many Ventir specs right now. If you give in to the fact that none of your tanks that you're running with at high keys are playing Ventir, that all of the popular specs from Balanced Druid, to Fire Mage, to Outlaw Rogue, to Windwalker Monk, Marksmanship Hunter, none of them are playing Ventir, which means the only spot left to play Ventir is Healer. That is also another reason, but if we are talking strictly related to 9.0.5 changes, then not really has happened when it comes to healers. We also have to move to the other role, which did not get too many changes when it comes to 9.0.5 related changes, which is tanks. Tanks also didn't really change that heavily. At the end of the day, we still have, the Vengeance Demon Hunter domination. Vengeance Demon Hunter, which has been nerfed quite a bit. However, it does not really change when it comes to the other specs. I also mentioned that this would have been probably a little bit too early to see the changes with tanks. We did have quite some changes, particularly for Blood Death Knight and particularly for Protection Warrior. Then again, it's just been a few days. It's not that all of a sudden Protection Warrior tanks are going to sprawl out of everywhere and start becoming the main new pick. This type of change is something that happens a little bit more over time. It's not like, for example, Subtlety Rogue is the best rogue spec, but after a patch, suddenly Assassination is, and then overnight you have a complete migration of Subtlety Rogues going Assassination because it's very easy to change. Or Mages. All Mages playing Fire, and then after a patch, Fire is butchered and Frost is the new meta, and overnight, over a couple of days, everyone is Frost. For tanks, it's a little bit different. It takes a little bit longer for tanks to become more popular over time. So what is left is DPS. Let's go and look if they have changed, particularly after 9.0.5. And I'll tell you something from the start. This is a week of records, because right in this screen that you see, right here, we already have 3 different records. I wonder if you can detect them. I will tell you the first one, right off the bat. The first record is that this is the highest percentage, the highest participation we have seen in Mythic Plus this season for Fury Warrior. This is the highest they've ever been, at around 15% representation. A couple of weeks ago, they were at 10%. The week before that, they were at 9%. 2 months ago, they were at 8%. And now they are getting close to 15%. Now, it's not that Fury Warrior has been buffed in 9.0.5. They have gotten a bunch of changes to the legendaries, but that was all useless because they were still planning to play with the Signet of Tormented Kings anyways, which they continue to do in Mythic Plus, so it doesn't really matter about that change. They have also gotten a pretty good change to the Necrolord banner, so we were wondering if Necrolord would have become a good one, but that was more of a question for Protection Warrior. Fury and Arms are still going to be locked in Ventir because of Condemn. Even in Mythic Plus, where Condemn is not as big of a mandatory pick, the Warriors are still going for Kyrian if they're not going for Ventir. So it's not that the banner buff made them rise in popularity. It's not that the legendary buffs made them rise in popularity. This has been more of a stable, continued rise in the strength of Fury Warrior. They have also risen. We have touched on this in the raid part, but not as much as Havoc and Retribution. They've also risen in performance over time in raids, so this is consistent with their improvement in performance from raids. I'm not gonna go too deep on the meme and keep reminding everyone that Warriors scale. Back at the start of the expansion, people were crying because Warriors were terrible and they were doing very badly, etc, etc. Well, now, at the very least, Fury in Mythic Plus is doing just fine. Now, where is the second record? The second record in this list is Windwalker Monk. Well, we mentioned Windwalker Monk dropping in performance when it comes to raid encounters, and they were already starting to drop a little bit in representation in raids. Well, unfortunately, this is the lowest that Windwalker Monk has been since the start of their rise. Since week 4 of Mythic Plus is when they started getting past 10%, and that would have been a journey which would have sent them all the way up to 16%. It's a journey that would have put them as the highest and most represented Mythic Plus spec together with Rogue for quite a few weeks since then. Well, now we have gotten the first drop. Just a couple of weeks ago, for example, Windwalker Monk, we left it at 16.1%, the most represented spec for melee DPS. And now they have dropped down to 10.9. They have been passed by multiple specs, including the aforementioned Fury Warrior but this is way more volatile. This is way more difficult to gauge because these type of numbers are gonna sway in percentages much more. In the 20 and higher keys, Monk went from 26 to 8, so completely dropped almost altogether. It is also worth mentioning that this is a tyrannical week, so it is more centered around single target boss damage. There is also less availability of keys because just last week, for example, the most pushed keys went all the way up to 25 and 26. Now, the vast majority of keys are capping at 22 during this week of Tyrannical, so there is even less of a pool of keys to observe in Mythic Plus. But still, there is a clear drop, at least for now, when it comes to Windwalker. And now there is the third record, the third milestone. This is a bigger one because this is the first time in the season, not just the first time since week 4, like Windwalker, the first time in the season that Havoc Demon Hunter has been this high in representation. You know, since the first week of Mythic Plus plus 10 pushing, Havoc Demon Hunter locked itself in the 10% range. They never really dropped below 10%, but they have, they have sort of navigated around 10.7, 11.1, 11.8, 10.9, that type of range. We had Rogue Outlaw being way more popular, being the meta pick. You had Unholy Death Knight at the start being very, very popular. And then, as we mentioned, around a month in, we have started seeing Windwalker rise. Now we have started seeing Fury Warrior rise, but Havoc Demon Hunter was still around the 11-ish%, getting passed by all these specs. Now, as I mentioned, Windwalker has lost quite a few percentages of representation. Where did they go? Who gained them? Well, Havoc is now past 15%. It's the highest they have gone ever in Mythic Plus this season. At our last update on this type of representation from Mythic Plus, they were at 12.8. And 12.8 was already their highest they have been. So now they have gotten a double improvement from their 12.8 very fresh record of a couple of weeks ago to 15.2 after the patch. Now, how much of this is thanks to the buff? Is it just a collateral buff because of raids? Because the more popular legendary is Collective Anguish for Havoc. It is the old double cast of Fell Devastation and I-Beam together, but we do have a much increased, higher prevalence now in Mythic Plus keys and high Mythic Plus keys of Burning Wound and Darkler Boon. Burning Wound and Darkler Boon are the two buffed legendaries for Havoc, so it's not exactly sure if this increase in popularity is just because they are performing better thanks to the buffed legendaries, because almost half of the Demon Hunters aren't even using those buffed legendaries. So again, it might just be a case of community perception. Everyone knows Havoc has been buffed, plus Havoc is doing better in raids. Therefore, when I have to look for a Mythic Plus group, hey, Havoc was getting buffed. Havoc has got some cool new legendaries. Let's invite a Havoc. Even though the Havoc in the group is not even gonna play with the new legendary, effectively making the spec the exact same it was 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago. And if this were the case, it would be a picture-perfect case of community perception, shifting their opinion on a certain spec, even though nothing technically has happened to that spec. So this is the situation for melee DPS. We will continue to monitor the rise and fall of some of these specs, at least until next week, when we have a little bit more clearer numbers, more representation, and more participation of all the specs. Now, as we touched on Windwalker, which was also touched in the raid part, where they did lose a lot of performance in raids, and then we also touched on Havoc, which also did better in raids, and now it's getting more representation in Mythic Plus. We touched on Fury Warrior, but we haven't really touched yet on Retribution and Assassination. Well, as I made a spoiler at the start of the video, the buff to Retribution was mostly single target. It did not really affect their AoE strength. Their Mythic Plus strength was already decent, and it has remained around that range. They haven't really increased in representation, and then there's Assassination. I mean, obviously, Assassination wasn't going to shine in a AoE and burst AoE heavy environment, so the buffs which are making Assassination shine more in raids are not really going to do anything to help them in Mythic Plus. Now, continuing this discussion, but moving over to range DPS, because after touching on all the other specs that have been buffed or nerfed for raid encounters becoming better or becoming worse, in the range DPS department we do have 2 more records. Unfortunately, one of these records is pretty depressing, it's pretty disappointing. Of the other specs we have touched on being changed heavily after 9.0.5, we have Elemental Shaman. Because despite this bar looking very tiny, this is a new record for Elemental. Before, their record was a measly 5% representation in plus 15 and higher keys. Now it has gotten to 6.5, a whopping 6.5. Which is, by the way, 30% more representation, Just because the number is small doesn't mean it's a small one for the spec as a whole. Because, of course, the buffs to Elemental were more encompassing than the buffs received by other specs like Retribution, which was mainly just single target, Assassination, which was about energy regen, but the spec itself doesn't have many tools to do AoE. The buff to Elemental also touched, some of their AoE parts, their chain lightning damage, their earthquake damage, so it has made them more apt at Mythic Plus keys, and now this is their improvement. Now, the other record is a negative one. If you have kept track, of course, we have touched on all of the specs being affected the most from 9.0.5, except for one. The one is Marksmanship Hunter. This is another record because this is the lowest Marksmanship Hunter has been in Mythic Plus. I know, I know, yes, it looks like a world first fucking problem because that is the lowest they have been and it's 20%. But it is. Marksmanship Hunter peaks went as high as 32% of representation. 32, 28, 29, 27, 25. We left a couple of weeks ago with Marksmanship Hunter being at 25. Now they are at 20.5. Just for clarity, Beast Mastery Hunter, while Marksmanship was at 25, was at 3, and now they are at 4.9. So they have also risen in exchange for the loss of Marksmanship. The other specs have not really changed that much. Particularly interesting to see eventually if Frost Mage is going to become more relevant. They have received quite a few buffs over time. Unfortunately, it's not that Fire Mage has received nerfs over time, so it's gonna be a little bit difficult to trump Fire Mage. But yeah, the main recipient of changes for the range DPS department were Elemental and Marksmanship. It is gonna be also kind of interesting to see Shadow Priest, because Shadow Priest, while really not changing in representation, still being around 8 to 9%, basically being the highest after the top 3 type of position. You know, after Fire, Balance, and Marksmanship, there is Shadow Priest and a Fix from Warlock. They have been kind of together. Shadow Priest did receive quite a few buffs to one of the legendaries, one of their forgotten legendaries since back in the day, which is Shadow Flame Prism. Shadow Flame Prism now is a way more taken legendary than before. It is now giving Shadow Priest a way more sustained and consistent AoE, which they can use for Mythic Plus to great effect. So it's going to be interesting to see if or whether or not this is going to prompt them to be a little bit more represented in Mythic Plus, maybe even particularly after the nerf to Marksmanship Hunter, for example. Of course, Mythic Plus is not always about damage. Then you also have to consider the fact that Marksmanship Hunters have immunity, they have multiple defensives, they have much better and faster mobility than Priests. They can even bring a few things like Bloodlust if they want to. The only advantage, I would say, for Priest, more so than Stamina, which is whatever, is the fact that they are not Night Fae, is the fact that Priests can bring some diversity, for example, being Ventir, many of them, or being Necrolord, essentially breaking the mold of the top 3 range DPS being all 3 Night Fae, which can bring some problems when you want to run different types of dungeons for the Covenant buffs that you can find. That's one of the main benefits you could have by dropping one of the stable Night Fae picks for your groups. But these are pretty much all of the changes that we have seen so far in 9.0.5. We have now looked at both the changes happening in Raids and in Mythic Plus, and we can see that changes that went to touch, you know, the core rotation of a spec, the core inner workings of a spec like Marksmanship and like Windwalker have affected them in their performance overall. Specs that were changed only in a tiny part or in a more precise part have only ended up working in that specific field, like Retribution Paladin's buff to single target affected them in Raids but not as much in Mythic Plus. Assassination Rogue was the same. To be fair, their buff to energy regeneration and their combo point generation, because your slice and dice gets extended, becomes pretty much infinitely lasting, meaning you don't have to constantly spend combo points. It can also help you in AoE. The problem is Assassination's AoE is garbage, so he wasn't going to trouble Outlaw Rogue being the king of rogue specs for Mythic Plus, meaning Assassination's growth was mostly in raid encounters. Elemental has gotten growth and improvement in both Mythic Plus and raid because their buffs were encompassing of all their toolkit. And then you also had Havoc. Havoc had gotten the clear improvement in raid encounters thanks to their new legendary Burning Wound. And then when it comes to Mythic Plus, it's a little bit more of a question mark. It's more likely going to be because the community values them more highly now, more so than actually performing better, since, as mentioned, half of the Havoc players are still running with their old legendary. So they are not actually equipping a buffed legendary right now. So it has less to do with actual improvement and more to do with community perception about them. For now, we're going to stop here. We're going to check next week if any of these numbers have stabilized or if they are continuing to grow or to fall, either way. So then we will be able to draw some more definitive conclusions for 9.0.5, awaiting the further possible changes that we're going to see in 9.1 for the next season. So now it's time to leave ourselves. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, one day, survival will break the 1% barrier.